The security footage timestamp read 3:47 a.m. when everything changed forever. In grainy black and white pixels, the cameras captured what would become the most controversial 30 seconds in corporate history. Victoria Sterling, the ruthless CEO of Sterling Dynamics, worth over $2 billion, stumbling through the rain-soaked streets of East Philadelphia at nearly 4 in the morning. But it wasn't her presence in the worst neighborhood in the city that would spark a media firestorm. It wasn't even the fact that she was alone, vulnerable, and clearly in distress. It was what happened next, when she knocked on the door of apartment 3B, when Marcus Thompson, a night shift janitor who cleaned her very office building, opened that door and let her inside. By morning, the headlines would scream about scandal, about impropriety, about a billionaire's fall from grace. But the truth? The truth was something no one expected. The rain hammered against the cracked windows of Marcus Thompson's third-floor apartment, like angry fists demanding entry. He jolted awake on his threadbare couch, neck stiff from another night of uncomfortable sleep. His daughter's medical bills spread across the coffee table like accusations. The digital clock on his phone glowed 3:47 a.m. in harsh blue numbers, and for a moment, Marcus thought the pounding was just the storm getting worse. Then he heard it again. 3 deliberate knocks on his apartment door. Marcus sat up slowly, every muscle in his 34-year-old body protesting. Who would be knocking at this hour? In this neighborhood, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. Bill collectors, angry landlords, or worse. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept beside the couch and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called through the thin wood. "Please," came a woman's voice, barely audible over the storm. "I need help." Marcus hesitated. The voice was different from what he expected. Refined, educated, desperate, but trying to hide it. He looked through the peephole and saw a figure hunched against the rain. Long, dark hair plastered to her head. Expensive-looking clothes soaked through. Against every instinct screaming at him to leave the door locked, Marcus turned the deadbolt. The woman who stumbled into his apartment was the last person he expected to see. Even drenched and shivering, even with mascara streaked down her cheeks, and her usually perfect composure shattered, he recognized her immediately. Victoria Sterling, the ice queen of Philadelphia's business world, the woman whose corporate headshot hung in the lobby of every building she owned, including the one where Marcus spent his nights mopping floors and emptying trash cans. "Ms. Sterling!" The words escaped before he could stop them. She looked up at him with eyes wide with shock and something that looked almost like relief. "You know who I am." "I work in your building, Sterling Tower, night shift maintenance." Victoria nodded, slowly, as if trying to process this information through whatever haze of shock she was operating under. "I'm sorry, I didn't know where else to go. My phone is dead. My car." She trailed off, wrapping her arms around herself. Marcus stood there for a moment, still holding the baseball bat, trying to reconcile the powerful woman he'd seen commanding boardrooms on the evening news with the vulnerable person shivering in his doorway. "What happened?" "My car broke down about 6 blocks from here. I was driving and the engine just died. I tried to call for help, but my phone battery died too." Victoria's voice was steady, but Marcus could hear the underlying tremor. "I started walking, looking for somewhere to call a cab, but everything was closed. The storm kept getting worse." Marcus glanced past her at the rain still pounding against his windows. 6 blocks in this weather, in those shoes, in this neighborhood. She was lucky nothing worse had happened. "You walked 6 blocks in this storm?" "I didn't have much choice." Victoria's chin lifted slightly, a flash of the steel that had built her empire. "I saw the light in your window. I was hoping someone might let me use their phone." If you're following this story so far, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you." Marcus set the bat aside and really looked at her. Victoria Sterling was soaked to the bone, her designer suit clinging to her frame, her usually immaculate hair hanging in wet strands. She was shivering, whether from cold or shock, he couldn't tell. But there was something else in her eyes, something that looked almost like fear. "Come in," he said, stepping back. "Sit down. I'll get you a towel." Victoria hesitated for just a moment, then stepped fully into the small apartment. Marcus watched as she took in her surroundings, the cramped space, the second-hand furniture, the stack of medical bills on the coffee table. Her gaze lingered on a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, a colorful crayon sketch of two stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "You have a daughter," she said. "Zoe. She's 8. She's staying at my sister's place tonight." Marcus disappeared into the bathroom and returned with a clean towel. "Here." Victoria accepted it gratefully, pressing it to her face. "Thank you." Marcus moved to the kitchen, a space barely large enough for one person, and put the kettle on. "Coffee? Tea? It's not much, but it's warm." "Tea would be wonderful." Victoria settled carefully on the edge of his couch, still holding the towel. "I'm sorry to impose like this. I know it's late." "Early," Marcus corrected with a slight smile. "And it's no imposition. No one should be out in weather like this." As the kettle heated, Marcus found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. Victoria Sterling, up close and without her usual armor of power suits and boardroom confidence, looked younger than the 42 he knew her to be. There were worry lines around her eyes he'd never noticed in the newspaper photos, and something in her posture suggested she was carrying weight that had nothing to do with her business empire. "You're building," she said suddenly. "You said you work nights at Sterling Tower." "Third shift maintenance. I clean the executive floors." Marcus kept his voice neutral. He'd learned long ago that people like Victoria Sterling saw people like him as furniture, useful but invisible. "How long have you worked there?" 3 years. Victoria was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could practically see her mental wheels turning. "I don't think I've ever seen you." "Most people don't." The kettle whistled, giving Marcus an excuse to turn away. "People like me, we're supposed to be invisible." When he handed her the steaming mug, their fingers brushed briefly. Victoria's hands were ice cold despite the towel. "That's not true," she said quietly. Marcus sat down in the chair across from her, cradling his own mug. "Isn't it? When's the last time you actually looked at the person cleaning your office?" Victoria opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it. A flush crept up her neck. "You're right, I don't know your name." "Marcus Thompson." "Marcus." She said it like she was testing how it felt. "I'm Victoria, but I suppose you already knew that." "Everyone knows who you are, Ms. Sterling. You're on the news, in the papers, on billboards. You're famous." "Am I?" Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Famous for what? Being ruthless? Being the ice queen who destroys everything she touches?" Marcus studied her face, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. "Is that what you think you are?" "It's what everyone else thinks." Victoria took a sip of tea, then looked directly at him. "What do you think?" The question caught Marcus off guard. When was the last time someone like Victoria Sterling had asked for his opinion about anything, let alone something personal? He considered his words carefully. "I think you're someone who's been walking alone in a storm a lot longer than just tonight." Victoria's breath caught, and for a moment Marcus thought she might cry. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and took another sip of tea. "You have a daughter," she said, changing the subject. "What's she like?" Marcus's face softened immediately. "Bright, funny, stubborn as hell. She wants to be a doctor when she grows up." "That's wonderful." Yeah, well, medical school costs money. Marcus gestured toward the bills on the coffee table. She's been having some health issues lately. Nothing serious, the doctors say, but the tests and specialists. He trailed off, realizing he was sharing too much with a stranger, even if that stranger was his ultimate boss. Victoria followed his gaze to the medical bills, and something shifted in her expression. That's why you work nights. Better pay. Better pay, and I can be home during the day when she gets out of school. Marcus had learned to keep the bitterness out of his voice when talking about the choices he'd been forced to make. My ex-wife, she couldn't handle Zoe's medical issues. Left when Zoe was 5. Said it was too much stress. I'm sorry. Marcus looked up, surprised by the sincerity in Victoria's voice. It's fine. We're better off without her. Still, no child should have to go through health problems, and no parent should have to face that alone. There was something in Victoria's tone that made Marcus think she was speaking from experience. You sound like you know something about that. Victoria was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I had a sister, younger. She got sick when we were kids, leukemia. My parents, they tried everything, spent everything, but the medical bills, the treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. Victoria's hands tightened around her mug. We lost her when I was 16. I'm sorry. It broke my family apart. My parents blamed each other, blamed themselves. They divorced 2 years later. My father started drinking. My mother remarried and moved across the country. Victoria's voice was flat, matter of fact, but Marcus could hear the pain underneath. That's when I decided I would never be powerless again. I would never be at the mercy of a system that decides who lives and who dies based on how much money they have. Marcus stared at her, seeing her clearly for the first time. That's why you built your empire. That's why I became ruthless. Victoria met his eyes. Because kindness is a luxury most people can't afford. Is it? Marcus asked quietly. Or is that what you tell yourself to justify the walls you've built? Victoria flinched as if he'd slapped her. For a moment, her carefully constructed composure cracked completely, and Marcus saw raw pain flash across her face. You don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Don't I? Marcus leaned forward. You're sitting in my apartment at 4 a.m, soaked to the bone, talking to a janitor about your dead sister. When's the last time you let anyone see this side of you? Victoria opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. I should go, she said, starting to stand. Where? Marcus asked. Your phone is dead, your car is broken, and it's still pouring out there. The sun won't be up for 3 hours. Victoria sank back onto the couch, the fight going out of her. I can't stay here. If someone sees me, if this gets out, gets out. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What? That you're human, that you needed help and someone helped you. You don't understand. People like me, we can't afford to look weak. The moment the vultures smell blood in the water, they circle. Victoria's voice was bitter. I've spent 20 years building my reputation, my company. One photograph of me coming out of some janitor's apartment at dawn would destroy everything. The casual dismissal in her voice, some janitor's apartment, hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stood up abruptly, his jaw tight. Right, because being seen with someone like me would be such a scandal. Victoria looked up at him, confusion flickering across her face. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? Marcus walked to the window, staring out at the storm. You know what, Ms. Sterling? You're right. People like you can't afford to be seen with people like me. We exist in different worlds, and those worlds don't mix. Marcus, I didn't mean... You know what the difference is between us? Marcus turned back to face her. When you needed help tonight, I didn't think about what it would cost me to give it. I just opened the door, but you're already calculating the price of accepting it. Victoria sat in stunned silence, Marcus's words hitting her like hammer blows. She opened her mouth to argue, to defend herself, but found she had no defense. He was right, even as she sat in his warm apartment drinking his tea, sharing pieces of her soul she'd never shared with anyone. Part of her was already crafting explanations, building stories, protecting herself. You're right, she said finally, her voice small. I am calculating. I always am. It's how I've survived. That's not surviving, Marcus said quietly. That's just existing. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small apartment something had shifted. Victoria felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her wet clothes and everything to do with the way this man saw through every defense she'd spent decades building. I don't know how to be any other way, she whispered. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and Victoria braced herself for judgment, for dismissal. Instead, his expression softened. Maybe it's time to learn. Victoria felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept locked away for so long she'd forgotten it was there. For the first time in 20 years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that there might be another way to live. I wouldn't know where to start. Marcus sat back down, his earlier anger replaced by something gentler. Maybe start by staying until the storm passes. No calculations, no exit strategies. Just be here right now with another human being who knows what it's like to carry too much weight alone. Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. Outside, lightning illuminated the sky, and thunder rolled across the city like a promise that the storm would eventually pass. But inside apartment 3B, two people who had lived their entire adult lives in isolation began the slow, careful work of building a bridge between their worlds. As the hours passed, they talked, really talked, in a way Victoria couldn't remember doing with anyone in years. Marcus told her about Zoe's latest art project, about the way she collected interesting rocks from the playground, about how she still slept with a stuffed elephant named Peanut. Victoria found herself smiling, genuinely smiling for the first time in months. In return, she told him about the loneliness of success, about boardrooms full of people who agreed with everything she said and meant none of it. She talked about the sister she still dreamed about sometimes, about the guilt she carried for surviving when Sarah hadn't. You know what Sarah used to say? Victoria asked as dawn began to creep through the windows. She said kindness was like planting seeds. You might not see them grow right away, but eventually they bloom into something beautiful. Sounds like a wise kid. She was. Victoria smiled sadly. She would have liked you. She always said the best people were the ones who helped without being asked. Marcus looked out at the lightening sky. Storms passing. Victoria followed his gaze and felt a pang of something that might have been regret. Yes, I suppose it is. Your phone should work now. You can call your driver, get back to your world. My world. Victoria repeated the words like they left a bad taste in her mouth. It doesn't have to be the only world, Marcus said quietly. Victoria looked at him, this man who had opened his door to a stranger, who had shared his tea and his stories and his truth without asking for anything in return. This man who saw her not as Victoria Sterling, billionaire CEO, but as a person caught in a storm. Marcus, she said, and her voice was steady now, sure. Would you like to have dinner sometime? Not as CEO and employee, just as people. Marcus studied her face, searching for calculation, for agenda. He found only hope, fragile and new, but real. I'd like that, he said, but I have to warn you, I cook all my meals at home. Budget constraints. Victoria's smile was radiant. That sounds perfect. As she gathered her things and called her driver, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years, anticipation for tomorrow that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or market shares. She had come to apartment 3B running from a storm, but she was leaving with something infinitely more valuable. She was leaving with the possibility that she didn't have to weather the storms of life alone anymore. When her car pulled up outside the building, Victoria turned back to Marcus one last time. "Thank you," she said, "for the tea, for the shelter, for treating you like a person, for helping me remember how to be one." The security footage hit the internet exactly 72 hours after Victoria Sterling left Marcus Thompson's apartment. The headline on Philadelphia Business Weekly screamed across every news feed in the city. "Sterling Dynamics CEO caught leaving janitor's apartment at dawn." Below it, a grainy black and white image showed Victoria stepping out of a rundown building in East Philadelphia, her hair disheveled, her expensive suit wrinkled. The story went viral within hours. Marcus first learned about it when his phone started buzzing non-stop at 6:30 in the morning. Text after text from numbers he didn't recognize, calls from reporters, notifications from social media platforms he'd never signed up for. When he finally answered one of the calls, a woman's voice fired questions at him like bullets. "Mr. Thompson, is it true you had an intimate relationship with Victoria Sterling? How long has this affair been going on? Did she pay you for your silence?" Marcus hung up immediately, his hands shaking. He looked at his phone screen. 47 missed calls, over 100 text messages. The notifications kept coming, a relentless digital assault. Zoe emerged from her bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Daddy? Who keeps calling?" "Nobody, sweetheart, just work stuff." Marcus forced a smile and guided her toward the kitchen. "How about pancakes for breakfast?" But as he poured batter into the pan, his phone continued to buzz against the counter like an angry wasp. Each notification felt like another nail in the coffin of the quiet life he'd built for himself and his daughter. The morning news was even worse. Channel 6 ran the story as their lead segment, complete with aerial shots of his apartment building and a deep dive into his background. They dug up his employment records, his divorce papers, even Zoe's medical bills from the hospital billing system that had somehow been leaked. Marcus Thompson, 34, works as a night shift janitor at Sterling Tower. Recently divorced, struggling with medical debt, and now apparently involved in a scandal that's rocking Philadelphia's business community. Marcus turned off the television, but the damage was spreading faster than he could contain it. By noon, there were reporters camped outside his building. By evening, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. Meanwhile, across the city in her 40th floor corner office, Victoria Sterling sat behind her desk, watching her carefully constructed world crumble in real time. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke. Board members demanding explanations, investors threatening to pull funding, reporters begging for statements. "The stock price has dropped 12% since this morning," her chief financial officer informed her grimly. "The board is calling an emergency meeting for tomorrow." Victoria stared out the window at the city below, her jaw clenched. "Have we found out who leaked the footage?" "Building security is investigating, but these things have a way of getting out. Someone probably sold it to the highest bidder." Victoria's assistant knocked on the door. "Ms. Sterling, Channel 8 is here for the interview you agreed to." "Cancel it." "But you said—" "I said cancel it." Victoria's voice was ice. "Cancel all media requests until further notice." When she was finally alone, Victoria allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was happening. 20 years of building her reputation, her empire, her carefully crafted image of invulnerability, and it was all being undone by a single photograph. Worse, she knew that Marcus was bearing the brunt of the public scrutiny, and that was unconscionable. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the news articles, each one more sensational than the last. The comment sections were vicious, filled with speculation and judgment, from people who knew nothing about what had actually happened that night. They painted Marcus as an opportunist, a gold digger, a man taking advantage of a powerful woman's moment of weakness. The truth was nowhere to be found. Victoria's fingers hovered over Marcus's contact information. She'd added his number to her phone after their conversation about dinner, but they hadn't spoken since. Now she wondered if calling him would make things worse or if staying silent was the greater cruelty. She was still staring at her phone when it rang. The caller ID showed her mother's number, a woman who hadn't called her in 6 months. "Victoria, I just saw the news. What in God's name is going on?" "Hello, Mother." Victoria closed her eyes, bracing herself. "Are you having some sort of breakdown? First you disappear in the middle of the night. Now you're involved with some janitor. Have you completely lost your mind? It's not what the media is saying." "Then what is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're throwing away everything you've worked for over some inappropriate relationship." Victoria felt something snap inside her. "You know what, Mother? For once in my life, I did something human. I accepted help from someone who offered it, without expecting anything in return. And if that's throwing away everything I've worked for, maybe what I've worked for isn't worth keeping." The line went silent for a long moment. "Victoria, you're scaring me." "I'm scaring myself," Victoria admitted, "but maybe it's about time." After she hung up, Victoria made a decision. She gathered her things, told her assistant to clear her calendar for the rest of the day, and drove across town to a neighborhood she'd only seen that one stormy night. The reporters were still camped outside Marcus's building, their news vans clogging the narrow street. Victoria parked 3 blocks away and walked, her designer heels clicking against the cracked sidewalk. She'd thrown on a baseball cap and sunglasses, but she still felt exposed, visible. When she reached the building, she didn't go to the front entrance where the cameras waited. Instead, she circled around to the back alley where a fire escape provided access to the upper floors. It took her 20 minutes to figure out which window belonged to apartment 3B. She knocked gently on the glass. Marcus appeared at the window, his face cycling through surprise, concern, and something that might have been relief. He opened the window and stepped back to let her climb inside. "Are you completely insane?" he asked as she tumbled gracelessly into his living room. "There are reporters everywhere." "I know." Victoria straightened her clothes and removed her sunglasses. "I had to see if you were okay." "Am I okay?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "I can't leave my apartment. Zoe can't go to school because there are cameras outside. I got a call from my supervisor saying I'm suspended pending an investigation into my conduct. So no, Victoria, I'm not okay." The casual use of her first name should have felt presumptuous, but instead, it felt right. More right than the formal distance that had defined every other relationship in her life. "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. "I never wanted this to happen." "What did you think would happen?" Marcus's voice was raw with exhaustion. "You're Victoria Sterling. I clean your building. We don't exist in the same universe, and now everyone knows it." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Marcus gestured toward the window where camera flashes were still visible. "Look what happened the moment someone saw us together. My daughter is getting death threats, Victoria. 8-year-old death threats because her father showed kindness to the wrong person." Victoria felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Death threats, anonymous messages, people saying she doesn't deserve medical care, that I'm a bad father, that we're both bottom feeders trying to bring down a successful woman. Marcus's hands clenched into fists. That little girl has been through enough. She didn't deserve this. Where is she now? My sister's place on the other side of town. At least there she can pretend her life is normal for a few more days. Victoria sank onto Marcus's couch, the same spot where she'd sat 3 nights ago, sharing tea and stories and pieces of her soul. Now it felt like a crime scene. I want to fix this. How? Marcus sat down across from her, his shoulders slumped with defeat. How do you fix what's already broken? The story is out there. People have made up their minds about what kind of man I am, what kind of father I am. By telling the truth. Marcus looked at her sharply. The truth? The truth is that the most powerful woman in Philadelphia spent 4 hours in my apartment, talking about her dead sister and her childhood trauma. You think that's going to make the story better? The truth is that I was in trouble and you helped me. No ulterior motives, no hidden agenda, just basic human decency. And you think people will believe that? Victoria was quiet for a long moment. I think some people will, and maybe that's enough. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Marcus studied her face, searching for something he couldn't name. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to call a press conference. I want to tell everyone exactly what happened that night. I want to clear your name. And destroy your reputation in the process, Victoria shrugged. What reputation? The Ice Queen who destroys everything she touches? Maybe it's time for a new reputation. Victoria, think about what you're saying. Your company, your board, your investors will have to accept that their CEO is a human being who makes human choices. Victoria's voice grew stronger with each word. I've spent 20 years being what everyone else wanted me to be. Maybe it's time I tried being what I actually am. Marcus leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. And what's that? A woman who met a good man on the worst night of her life and remembered what kindness looks like. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and terror. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the knot of anger and fear he'd been carrying since the story broke. They'll crucify you, he said quietly. Maybe. Or maybe they'll see that successful people are allowed to be vulnerable sometimes. That power doesn't mean you never need help. And if they don't, if this ruins everything you've built? Victoria met his eyes steadily. Then I'll build something new, something better. They sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Marcus spoke. Zoe asked me about you yesterday. Victoria's heart jumped. What did she say? She wanted to know if you were the lady who needed help. I told her yes. Then she asked if you were in trouble now because people were being mean to you. Marcus's voice softened. She said we should help you back because that's what families do for each other. Victoria felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Families? 8-year-olds have a different perspective on relationships than adults do. They don't see bank accounts or social status. They just see people who care about each other. And do we care about each other? Marcus was quiet for so long that Victoria began to think she'd overstepped, assumed too much. Then he smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since she'd climbed through his window. Yeah, he said, I think we do. Victoria felt something bloom in her chest, warm and unfamiliar and absolutely terrifying. Then let's fight for it. Let's fight for the truth. Together. Together. Marcus nodded slowly. Okay, but we do this right. We tell the whole truth, not just the parts that make us look good. Agreed. Victoria pulled out her phone. I'll call my publicist, set up a joint press conference for tomorrow morning. Victoria? Marcus's voice stopped her as she began dialing. What if this doesn't work? What if telling the truth isn't enough? Victoria looked around the small apartment that had become the epicenter of a media firestorm, then back at the man who had risked everything just by opening his door to a stranger in need. Then at least we'll know we tried. At least we'll know we chose to stand together instead of being torn apart by other people's assumptions. And Zoe? Zoe will see that her father is a man of integrity who stands up for what's right, even when it's hard. And maybe someday, that will matter more than anything the newspapers say about us today. Marcus extended his hand toward Victoria. Partners? Victoria grasped it firmly, feeling the calluses from years of honest work, the strength that came from carrying responsibility without complaint. Partners. As they began planning their response to the media storm swirling around them, neither of them noticed the figure crouched on the fire escape outside the window, camera clicking steadily in the fading afternoon light. By evening, new photos would surface, Victoria Sterling and Marcus Thompson sitting close together, hands clasped, faces serious but united. The headlines the next morning would be even more sensational than the first round. But this time, Victoria and Marcus would be ready for them. This time, they would face the storm together. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the Sterling Dynamics headquarters, but by 8:30, the crowd outside had grown beyond anything Victoria's security team had anticipated. News vans lined the street 3 deep, reporters jostled for position, and hundreds of curious onlookers had gathered to witness what some were calling the business scandal of the decade. Inside the building, Victoria stood in front of a mirror in her private washroom, adjusting her jacket for the 5th time. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a simple navy suit, minimal jewelry, her hair pulled back in a professional but not severe style. She wanted to look composed but approachable, powerful but human. Her hands were shaking. "Miss Sterling?" Her assistant's voice came through the door. "Mr. Thompson is here." Victoria took a deep breath and opened the door. Marcus stood in her office, wearing what was clearly his best suit, a charcoal gray that was slightly too big for him but pressed and clean. He looked nervous but determined, his shoulders squared, his jaw set. "Ready for this?" Victoria asked. "No," Marcus replied honestly, "but let's do it anyway." They walked to the elevator together, neither speaking. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on them like a physical force. In 15 minutes, they would either clear their names or destroy their futures, and there was no way to know which it would be. The conference room was packed beyond capacity. Cameras lined the walls, reporters filled every seat, and the air crackled with anticipation. Victoria and Marcus took their places at the podium, and immediately the room erupted with shouted questions. "Miss Sterling, is it true you're having an affair?" "Mr. Thompson, how much is she paying you to stay quiet?" "Victoria, what does your board think about this scandal?" Victoria raised her hand, and gradually the room quieted. When she spoke, her voice carried across the space with clarity and authority. 3 nights ago, I was driving home from a late meeting when my car broke down in East Philadelphia. It was storming, my phone was dead, and I found myself stranded in a neighborhood I didn't know. I was scared, cold, and alone. The room was completely silent now. I knocked on the door of the nearest apartment building, hoping someone would let me use their phone. The man who answered that door was Marcus Thompson. He didn't know who I was. He didn't ask for identification or references. He simply saw someone in need and offered help. Victoria paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some skeptical, some curious, some openly hostile. Mr. Thompson gave me shelter from the storm. He made me tea. He let me sit on his couch and call my driver when my phone charged. We talked for a few hours about life, about family, about the things that matter to people regardless of their bank account balance. When my ride arrived, I left. That's the entire story. A reporter shouted from the back. If it was so innocent, why did it take 3 days for you to respond? Marcus stepped forward to the microphone. Because we didn't think we'd done anything wrong. Because in the world I come from, helping someone isn't newsworthy. It's just what decent people do. His voice was steady, but Victoria could see the tension in his shoulders. I'm a single father, Marcus continued. I work nights cleaning office buildings so I can be home when my daughter gets out of school. 3 nights ago, a woman in distress knocked on my door and I let her in. If that same situation happened tomorrow, I'd make the same choice. Mr. Thompson, another reporter called out, are you saying there's no romantic relationship between you and Ms. Sterling? Marcus and Victoria exchanged a quick glance. They had discussed this question, knowing it would come up, but standing here in front of the cameras, the answer felt more complicated than it had in private. We barely know each other, Victoria said carefully, but I hope that will change. The room erupted again, but Victoria continued speaking over the noise. I hope it will change because I met someone that night who reminded me of values I thought I'd lost. Kindness without expectation of reward. Generosity despite personal hardship. Integrity that doesn't waver based on who's watching. She turned to look at Marcus, her voice growing softer but no less clear. I've spent 20 years building walls to protect myself from the kind of vulnerability I felt that night. But maybe those walls have been protecting me from the wrong things. Maybe they've been keeping out exactly what I needed most. What's that, Ms. Sterling? A reporter asked. Victoria smiled, and for the first time since the scandal broke, it was genuine. A reminder that success isn't measured only in dollars and that the most valuable things in life can't be bought. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, but the tone had shifted. Instead of hunting for scandal, the reporters found themselves asking about second chances, about cross-class relationships, about the cost of isolation at the top of the corporate ladder. When it was over, Victoria and Marcus walked back to the elevator in silence. It wasn't until the doors closed that either of them spoke. How do you think that went? Marcus asked. I think we told the truth, Victoria replied. Now we see if the truth is enough. As they rode up to Victoria's office, both of them knew that everything had changed. The scandal would continue to generate headlines for a few more days, but the narrative had shifted. They were no longer the subjects of a salacious affair story. They had become something more dangerous to the status quo. An example of authentic human connection crossing social boundaries. And in a world that often seemed designed to keep people isolated in their own economic bubbles, that was revolutionary. The press conference had been a success by most measures. The initial wave of scandal coverage had given way to more thoughtful pieces about class, connection, and the human cost of extreme wealth inequality. Editorial writers praised Victoria's vulnerability and Marcus's dignity. Social media, while still divided, had shifted toward support for their unconventional friendship. But success in the media didn't translate to success in the boardroom. Victoria knew trouble was coming when her assistant's voice carried a tremor as she announced the emergency board meeting. They're all here, Miss Sterling, including Mr. Harrison. Richard Harrison, the silver-haired patriarch who had helped finance Victoria's early expansion, who held enough shares to make or break her leadership position. A man who valued reputation above all else and had made his disapproval of recent events crystal clear. Victoria straightened her shoulders and walked into the conference room, where 12 of the most powerful people in Philadelphia business sat around the mahogany table like a tribunal. The silence was deafening. Gentlemen, ladies. Victoria took her seat at the head of the table, her voice steady despite the storm she could see brewing in their faces. Richard Harrison didn't waste time on pleasantries. Victoria, in 30 years of business, I've never seen such a spectacular display of poor judgment. Your little publicity stunt yesterday has cost us 3 major clients and spooked investors across the board. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It was the truth. The truth? Harrison's laugh was bitter. The truth is that you've jeopardized a billion-dollar company over some misguided sympathy for a janitor. The truth is that your stockholders are questioning your fitness to lead. Board member Sarah Chen leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but firm. Victoria, we understand that you went through a traumatic experience. Car accidents can be deeply unsettling. Perhaps you should consider taking some time off, letting the dust settle. I'm not traumatized, Victoria said sharply. I'm awake. For the first time in 20 years, I'm actually awake. To what? Demanded Harrison. To the fact that you're willing to destroy everything you've built for a man you met 3 days ago? Victoria felt heat rise in her chest. I'm not destroying anything. I'm choosing to live according to values that matter more than stock prices. Values don't pay salaries, Victoria. Values don't fund research and development. Values don't keep this company competitive in a global marketplace. Maybe that's the problem. The words slipped out before Victoria could stop them, and the room erupted. Board members talking over each other, voices raised, the carefully maintained veneer of corporate civility cracking under the pressure. Harrison slammed his hand on the table, silencing the room. That's enough. Victoria, I'm calling for a vote of no confidence. Either you return to the leadership style that built this company, or we'll find someone who will. Victoria looked around the table at faces she'd known for years, people she'd considered allies, even friends. She saw fear in their eyes, not of her, but of change, of uncertainty, of anything that threatened their carefully controlled world. You want to vote me out because I showed compassion to someone who helped me? We want to vote you out because you've lost perspective, Harrison replied coldly. Because you're making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. Because you've forgotten that a CEO's first responsibility is to shareholders, not to some romantic notion of social justice. Victoria stood slowly, her hands flat on the table. And you've forgotten that shareholders aren't the only stakeholders in this company. What about the employees who build our products? What about the communities where we operate? What about the basic human decency that should guide every decision we make? Human decency doesn't appear on quarterly reports. Maybe it should. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 20 years of work hanging in the balance. Everything she'd built, everything she'd sacrificed for, reduced to this moment. I want to tell you all a story, she said quietly. When I was 16 years old, I watched my sister die because we couldn't afford experimental treatment that might have saved her life. I swore that day that I would never be powerless again, that I would build something so strong, so successful, that I could protect the people I loved. She paused, looking at each board member in turn. But somewhere along the way, I stopped protecting people and started protecting things. Market share, profit margins, stock prices. I became exactly the kind of person who would have let my sister die to preserve the bottom line. Victoria, Sarah Chen started, but Victoria held up a hand. 3 nights ago, a man I'd never met opened his door to a stranger in a storm. He didn't ask for my credit rating or my references. He just saw someone who needed help and gave it. And in doing so, he reminded me of the person I used to be before I became afraid of everything except success. Harrison's voice was ice. So you're choosing him over us? Victoria considered the question carefully. I'm choosing the possibility of becoming someone worth knowing over the certainty of remaining someone I don't even like. Then you leave us no choice. Harrison's tone was final. All in favor of a vote of no confidence in Victoria Sterling as Chief Executive Officer. 8 hands rose around the table. Victoria counted them methodically, her expression never changing. 8 votes, enough to remove her from the company she'd built from nothing. "The motion carries," Harrison announced. "Victoria, you have 24 hours to clean out your office and transition your responsibilities. Security will escort you from the building." Victoria nodded once, then gathered her papers with steady hands. As she reached the door, she turned back to face the room one last time. "I hope someday you all find something worth more than money," she said quietly, "because when you do, you'll understand why this was the easiest decision I've ever made." The elevator ride to her office felt like a descent into a different world. 20 floors down from the boardroom, and already she could feel the weight of corporate expectations lifting from her shoulders. Her assistant was crying when Victoria reached her desk. "Ms. Sterling, I'm so sorry. I heard what happened. This is so unfair." Victoria managed a smile. "Actually, Jessica, I think this might be the fairest thing that's happened to me in years." As she packed her personal belongings, surprisingly few after 20 years in the same office, Victoria felt her phone buzzing with messages. News of her ouster had already leaked to the press. Within hours, the story would dominate the business pages. Sterling Dynamics Board removes CEO after scandal. She was almost finished packing when Marcus appeared in her doorway. He looked haggard, exhausted, but his eyes held the same steady kindness that had drawn her to him 3 nights ago. "I heard," he said simply. "How did you get up here? Security should have..." "Turns out night shift janitors know a lot of back ways through buildings." Marcus stepped into the office, looking around at the mahogany and marble that had been Victoria's kingdom. "Are you okay?" Victoria considered the question seriously. Was she okay? She'd just lost the company she'd spent her adult life building. Her net worth had probably dropped by hundreds of millions of dollars. Her professional reputation was in tatters. The business community would view her as a cautionary tale for years to come. "I'm terrified," she said honestly, "but I'm also free. For the first time in 20 years, I'm completely free." Marcus moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring in the chaos. "What will you do now?" "I don't know." Victoria looked out the window at the city spread below her, no longer seeing it as territory to be conquered, but as a community to be served. "I have money saved, investments. I won't starve. But I have no idea who I am if I'm not Victoria Sterling, CEO." "Maybe that's the point," Marcus said gently. "Maybe you get to find out who Victoria Sterling, human being, actually is." Victoria felt tears threatening for the first time since the boardroom confrontation. "What if I don't like who that person turns out to be?" "From what I've seen so far, I think you will." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Finally, Victoria spoke. "Marcus, that dinner you agreed to, is the offer still open?" "Every night this week," he replied without hesitation. "Zoe's been asking about you. She wants to show you her rock collection." Victoria laughed, the sound surprising both of them. I'd like that very much." As they left the Sterling Dynamics building together, Victoria carrying a single box of personal items, Marcus walking beside her like a bodyguard, the waiting reporters shouted questions about her plans, her regrets, her future. Victoria paused at the bottom of the steps, looking back at the glass tower that had been her life for 2 decades. "Ms. Sterling," a reporter called, "do you regret the choices that led to your firing?" Victoria considered the question, then smiled, a real smile full of possibility and hope. "I regret that it took me this long to make them," she said. 6 months later, Victoria stood in the community center in East Philadelphia, watching Marcus teach a group of teenagers how to repair a broken air conditioning unit. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he explained the intricacies of refrigerant flow, his patience endless as the kids peppered him with questions. The Sterling Foundation, Victoria's new venture, funded entirely from her personal savings, had opened its doors 3 months earlier. It provided vocational training, financial literacy classes, and small business loans to residents of underserved neighborhoods. Marcus served as the director of practical education, teaching skills that could lead to stable, well-paying careers. Victoria had taken on the role of strategic development, but her real education came from spending time in communities she'd never seen despite living in the same city her entire life. She learned about food deserts and housing discrimination and the impossible mathematics of minimum wage survival. She learned that intelligence and ambition were distributed equally across all zip codes, but opportunity was not. "Miss Victoria!" Zoe's voice broke through her reverie. The 8-year-old came running across the community center's main room, her arms outstretched. Victoria caught her in a hug, marveling as always at how natural it felt. Zoe had been the bridge between Victoria's old life and her new one, accepting the former CEO into their small family with the uncomplicated faith that children possessed. "Daddy's teaching the big kids about air conditioners," Zoe announced importantly, "and I helped." "Did you? What did you help with?" "I held the flashlight and told everyone to be quiet when Daddy was talking." Zoe beamed with pride. "He said I was the best assistant he ever had." Victoria looked across the room at Marcus, who was now showing a teenage girl how to test an electrical connection. 6 months ago, she wouldn't have understood the value of what he was doing, the way he was building confidence along with technical skills, the way he treated each student as someone with potential rather than someone with problems. Now she understood that this work, messy, personal, immediate, was infinitely more valuable than any quarterly profit report she'd ever filed. "Miss Victoria," Zoe tugged on her sleeve, "are you going to marry my daddy?" Victoria nearly choked on her coffee. "Zoe, that's a very personal question." "But are you?" Zoe persisted with 8-year-old directness. "Because I think you should. You make him smile the real way, not the sad way." Before Victoria could formulate an answer, Marcus appeared beside them, apparently having overheard enough of the conversation to look mortified. "Zoe, we've talked about this. Adults don't just get married because kids think it's a good idea." "Why not?" Zoe asked reasonably. "Kids have good ideas sometimes." Marcus caught Victoria's eye, and they both started laughing. The sound echoed through the community center, drawing smiles from the teenagers working on their air conditioning project. "Come here," Victoria said, pulling both Marcus and Zoe into an impromptu group hug. "You both have very good ideas." That evening, as they walked home through the neighborhood that had become Victoria's second home, Zoe skipped ahead while Victoria and Marcus talked about the day's work. "The Henderson boy got his GED results today," Marcus reported. "Passed with flying colors. Says he wants to apply to community college." "That's wonderful. What about Maria? Did she decide about the small business loan?" "She's going to apply. Wants to open a catering company. Says her grandmother's recipes are too good to keep secret." Victoria smiled, remembering her first meeting with Maria, a 35-year-old single mother who worked 3 jobs and still had a dream of entrepreneurship. The old Victoria would have seen only the risks, the statistical likelihood of small business failure. The new Victoria saw determination, skill, and potential waiting for opportunity. "Marcus." Victoria stopped walking, suddenly nervous about something she'd been carrying around for weeks. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever miss it? The simplicity of before, when you didn't have to worry about board meetings and grant applications and whether you're making the right choices for hundreds of people?" Marcus considered the question seriously. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I think about what we're building here, and I remember that the best things in life are never simple. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. Besides, I've got a pretty good partner to help figure it out. Victoria squeezed his hand, thinking about the journey that had brought them here, the storm that had driven her to his door, the media circus that had forced them to defend their connection, the boardroom confrontation that had cost her everything she thought she wanted and given her everything she actually needed. "Daddy, Miss Victoria," Zoe called from ahead. "Look what I found." She held up a smooth, perfectly round stone, polished by rain and time into something beautiful. "It's a treasure," she announced solemnly, "for the collection." Victoria knelt down to examine the stone, remembering the first time Zoe had shown her the shoebox full of rocks, shells, and interesting scraps of metal that constituted her treasure collection. Each piece had a story, where she'd found it, what made it special, why it deserved a place among her most prized possessions. "It's perfect," Victoria agreed. "Where did you find it?" "Right there, by the tree where you and Daddy always hold hands," Zoe said matter-of-factly. Victoria looked up at Marcus, who was fighting a smile. "We don't always—" "Yes, you do," Zoe interrupted with the confidence of someone who paid attention. "Every time we walk past that tree, you hold hands. It's like it's magic or something." As they continued toward home, Victoria reflected on magic, not the fairy tale kind that solved problems with a wave of a wand, but the real kind that happened when people chose connection over isolation, when they chose courage over comfort, when they chose to see the treasure in ordinary things. 3 blocks from the apartment, they passed the burned-out shell of a building that was being renovated into affordable housing units. The Sterling Foundation had provided funding for the project, but Victoria had insisted that local residents be hired for the construction work and that the units be sold to families from the neighborhood. "It's looking good," Marcus observed, nodding toward the construction scaffolding. 60 families, Victoria said with satisfaction. 60 families who won't have to choose between rent and food. And 60 families who will know that someone believed they deserved a decent place to live, Marcus added. As they reached their building, Marcus and Zoe still lived in the same apartment, but Victoria had moved into the unit next door, creating an unconventional but happy family arrangement. Victoria felt the deep contentment that came from work that mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and froze. "What is it?" Marcus asked, noticing her expression. Victoria showed him the screen. The message was from Richard Harrison, the board member who had orchestrated her removal from Sterling Dynamics. "Victoria, board meeting went badly. Stock down 40% since you left. Clients jumping ship. We may have made a mistake. Would you consider returning? Name your terms." R.O.H. Marcus read the message twice, then looked at Victoria. "What are you thinking?" Victoria stared at her phone for a long moment, then deleted the message without responding. "I'm thinking," she said, "that some mistakes are the best things that ever happened to you." She looked up at the apartment building, modest, slightly shabby, but full of life and laughter and love. Then at Marcus and Zoe, the family she'd found when she stopped looking for success and started looking for meaning. "I'm thinking I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." That night, after Zoe had fallen asleep, clutching her new treasure, Victoria and Marcus sat on the fire escape outside his window, looking out at the city lights. The view was different from her old penthouse, closer to street level, more immediate, more real. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked quietly. Victoria considered the question one last time. She thought about the corner office, the power lunches, the quarterly reports that had once defined her worth. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, successful, wealthy, and profoundly alone. Then she thought about Zoe's laugh, about the teenagers in the community center, learning skills that would change their lives, about the way Marcus looked at her like she was someone worth knowing rather than someone worth impressing. "Just one," she said finally. Marcus turned to her, concerned. "What's that?" Victoria smiled, reaching for his hand. "I regret that it took a storm to bring me home." As if summoned by her words, thunder rumbled in the distance. But this time, Victoria didn't feel the urge to run for shelter. This time, she was exactly where she belonged. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. Ready for whatever comes next? Victoria looked at this man who had opened his door to a stranger and somehow opened her heart to possibilities she'd never imagined. "With you, I'm ready for anything." The first drops of rain began to fall, but they stayed where they were, watching the storm approach together. And in that moment, Victoria understood that the greatest treasure wasn't something you could find or build or buy. It was something you could only receive when you finally learned to give it away. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.